6 years after my husband caught me cheating with my boss. Here's what happened. 6 years ago, my entire life fell apart. It was a moment I never expected, a reckoning for mistakes I thought I could keep hidden. But when my husband, Mark, found out about my affair with my boss, it shattered our lives in ways I couldn't have imagined. At the time, I was working as a marketing executive at a prestigious company. The stress was overwhelming, and I spent more time at the office than at home. My boss, Richard, was charming, successful, and charismatic. Everything you'd expect from someone who had quickly climbed the corporate ladder. I admired his work ethic and found myself drawn to his confidence. It started innocently enough, late-night work sessions, shared frustrations, and eventually casual dinners after long days. Before I knew it, what began as a professional relationship turned into something far more dangerous. The affair wasn't planned. I loved Mark, or at least I thought I did, but I had begun to feel disconnected from him. We had been married for 10 years, and the spark had faded under the weight of routine. We felt more like roommates than lovers. I justified my actions by telling myself I was just looking for what Mark and I had lost. Richard made me feel desired and excited again, emotions I hadn't felt in years. The affair lasted about 6 months before Mark found out. He wasn't a suspicious man by nature, which is probably why I got away with it for so long. But one evening, when I was working late again, Mark found a string of text messages on my phone while it was charging on the kitchen counter. The messages weren't explicit, but were suggestive enough to raise red flags. His gut told him something was wrong. When he confronted me, I could see the devastation in his eyes. I tried to lie at first, but he didn't believe me. In that moment, my world collapsed. I confessed, knowing there was no way I could salvage the situation with more lies. Mark didn't scream or shout. His reaction was the opposite of what I had expected. He looked at me with such profound sadness that it broke my heart. "Why, Clara?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How could you do this to us?" I didn't have a good answer then, and I still don't. That night, Mark left and stayed with a friend for weeks. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was through text messages, usually about bills or what to do with the house. Mark asked for a separation, and I moved in with my sister while we sorted out the details. The next year was a blur of lawyers, counseling sessions that felt more like punishment than healing, and the agony of watching our marriage crumble bit by bit. We filed for divorce. There was no dramatic courtroom battle or scandalous revelations, just a slow, painful unraveling of the life we had built together. After the divorce, I quit my job. I couldn't face Richard at the office anymore, and I wasn't even sure if my feelings for him were real or just a byproduct of my failing marriage. It didn't matter. The affair ended as abruptly as it had started. I cut off all contact with Richard, who seemed just as eager to move on and forget everything. The first couple of years after the divorce were the hardest. I carried an unbearable sense of guilt and shame for what I had done, not just to Mark, but to myself. I had thrown away a decade-long marriage for a fleeting moment of excitement, and I didn't know how to forgive myself for that. Therapy helped, but only so much. I often wondered where Mark was, how he was doing, and if he had moved on. Part of me hoped he had, while another part of me wished I could somehow undo the past and find a way back to him. Then, 3 years after our divorce, something unexpected happened. I ran into Mark at a mutual friend's birthday party. It was awkward at first. We hadn't seen each other since signing the final divorce papers, and I had no idea what to say. But Mark, ever the gentleman, broke the ice. We had a brief, polite conversation about work and our families. I noticed he was wearing a ring on his right hand, an old habit of his when he was nervous. It struck me then that he wasn't the same person I had been married to. He seemed stronger, more self-assured. We parted ways that night, but it opened a line of communication that hadn't existed before. We started texting occasionally, nothing more than friendly exchanges at first. Gradually, the conversations grew longer and more personal. I found myself confiding in him again, sharing my thoughts and struggles, and he did the same. We talked about the past, about what went wrong, and even about the affair. It was painful, but it was also cathartic. Mark said he had forgiven me, though he admitted he could never forget. He told me he had dated a few people since the divorce, but hadn't settled down. He said he wasn't looking for anything serious and was focusing on his career. Over the next 2 years, we became friends again. It wasn't the same as before, of course. There was a deep scar that couldn't be erased. But there was also a shared history that kept pulling us back together. I didn't know if there was a chance for reconciliation, and I was too afraid to ask. I was content, at least for a while, with just being in his life in whatever capacity he allowed. Then, earlier this year, something changed. Mark's mother fell ill, and he reached out to me, asking if I could visit her in the hospital. I had always been close to her during our marriage, and she had never blamed me for what happened between Mark and me. She was as kind and loving as ever, even as she lay frail in that hospital bed. She took my hand and whispered, "You too should give it another shot. Life's too short for regrets." I brushed it off as a sweet sentiment, not thinking much of it, but Mark and I couldn't ignore her words. They hung in the air, unspoken but ever present. We started spending more time together, going out for dinners, and even taking a weekend trip to the cabin where we used to go during happier times. It wasn't a grand romantic reconciliation, but it was a step toward something. We didn't label it or put pressure on ourselves. We just enjoyed being in each other's company again. It's been 6 years since Mark found out about my affair with Richard. While I can't say we've gotten back together, I can say we've reached a place of understanding and even friendship. We've acknowledged that what happened was painful, but we've also recognized that people make mistakes. We've both changed in ways that made us stronger. While the future is still uncertain, there's a sense of closure now that wasn't there before. Mark and I may never fully repair what was broken, but we've built something new, something different, perhaps even better, and that, in its own way, feels like a second chance, even if it's not the one I had originally hoped for.